Hi, and welcome to the first podcast for AP Biology. I'm going to talk about just an introduction to biology, and this is covered kind of in Chapter 1. I've always thought that you could talk about everything you need to know about biology just in a simple leaf. A leaf has evolved through a process called natural selection to have this perfect shape from a point at the end to on this one you can see little hairs on it. All of those have adapted to its specific role, which is to take in light and also carbon dioxide. It's got photosynthesis going on, it's got respiration, there's so much in a leaf. And so I'll talk about it for the rest of the year. Okay, Chapter 1 has several themes, and there are several themes in biology that will start with Chapter 1, and it'll kind of carry us throughout the book. First is what's called the hierarchy of life. That means that we have these different levels of hierarchy, and we get emergent properties as we get more to a bigger and bigger level. What's at the top level, obviously it's going to be the biosphere, so where we ever have life on our planet. What's at the bottom level, it's going to be those macromolecules and the chemistry that makes up life. Number 2 is the environmental interactions. In other words, it's interactions between living things and their environment. Homeostasis is a big word that we'll talk about with that. Next is the idea of cells, and cells is the basic unit of life, and there's a couple of different types of those we'll talk about in just a second. We also have common features of life, in other words, things that tie them all together. The ability to adapt, ability to reproduce, the ability to use energy, but one of the big ones, obviously, is the idea that they all contain the same genetic material, and that would be DNA. Next theme is what's the 3 domains of life, and when I took biology we actually had this really complicated system where we had something called monerans. We've kind of done away with that, and in the last 20 years we've learned a lot about a type of life called archaea, or ancient life. And so what we find is there's actually 3 types of life. We've got us, we call those eukaryotic, we've got what's called the bacteria, and then we have these archaea, which we'll talk more about. And then the biggest theme in all of biology is this idea of evolution, and we credit Darwin with his theory of natural selection that kind of explains how evolution occurs. But remember, evolution is simply, at the basic level, it's just changes in the gene frequency, and so natural selection is just one of the causes. And then the other thing that I kind of put over here to the side is this idea of the scientific method. So I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about what that is and how it makes science a little bit different from just about everything else that we have. So let the show begin. If we start with the hierarchy of life, we start at the very big, and that's called the biosphere. And then we break that down into ecosystems, communities, populations, organisms. Organisms then are broken down into organs, which are made up of tissues, which are made up of cells, and eventually we get down to what are called these macromolecules. And so as we go in reverse order, so as we go like this, so from the DNA by itself doesn't do anything, but as we put that inside a nucleus and inside of a cell, then we get these emergent properties. In other words, DNA is able to pass that genetic material from generation to generation. And so there's this beautiful hierarchy, and we see that in all life. Next, we've got environmental interactions, and so if we think about this tree right here, this tree is taking in energy in the form of light. It's giving off energy as well in the form of heat. But maintaining this kind of an internal, sometimes referred to it as an internal pond, or this inside of an environment, and keeping that or maintaining that while surrounded with an environment that is not quite as calm is one of the themes that we'll talk about. And a word that you want to kind of put in your long-term memory is something called homeostasis. In other words, how do I keep my insides stable? Next one is this idea of cells. Here are the 2 major types of cells. We have what are called eukaryotic cells. That's what we're made up of. They're called eukaryotic because they have a nucleus, or a true center to that cell. Then we also have prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are what you think of as bacteria. Now, do they have DNA? Yeah. The DNA is just simply loose inside this, what's called the nucleoid region inside that cell. It's not organized inside the nucleus. But you can see some other big differences here between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cell. One of the first ones being size. So eukaryotic cells in general are going to be much bigger. Our DNA is also organized into what are called chromosomes, and so that's a section of DNA that stops. If you're looking at a prokaryotic cell, their DNA doesn't stop. It actually goes back to a loop. So it's another difference. Number of differences between those two different types. Next is the idea of that there are a set of core features that are shared between all organisms. One is this idea of order. One is this idea of regulation, or regulation of, for example, internal body temperature, and that's the function of these ears right here. One is the idea that organisms grow and develop over their life. Grow, what does that mean? Grow means to get more cells and those cells to become bigger. Develop means for those cells to change. And so this alligator is actually, I'm not sure, yeah, I think that's an alligator, is going to get larger because it's going to get more and more cells, but it's also going to go through these changes within its life, and call that development. Next is that energy processing, where we're taking energy in and we're utilizing it. We respond to our environment, we reproduce, and then we have evolutionary adaptations. And so is a dog alive? Yeah, it satisfies all 7 of those. Is lightning alive? No. It doesn't satisfy many of those. What about a stomach? Is a stomach alive? Well, not really. By its own, a stomach is not going to have a population of stomachs. They can't reproduce, and so we'd say no. And so these are the 7 that kind of say, is this alive or is it not? But there are some things that are kind of borderline, like what about a virus? But we'll talk about that later. Next is the idea that we have 3 types of life. First type of life, we used to think that there were just 2, the eukaryotics and the prokaryotics, but now we know that they have 3 domains, and so that's how we classify life. We've got domain bacteria, things like E. coli, staphylococcus, they're all going to be in that bacteria. We have eukarya, which makes up all the things you think of as life, all the way from a sloth to, we've got some cyanobacteria here, to a plant, to a fungus. All of those are going to have a nucleus, so those are going to be those bigger cells. But now we have this other group of life called the archaea. And in Montana, we have something really close to us, Yellowstone Park, that actually has a lot of archaea, and that's where a lot of these discoveries were made. Who are we more related to? I mean, looking at it, we're much more related to archaea. And in fact, they're much more related to us than they are to bacteria, even though they look really similar. Next is the idea of evolution, and what is that? It's that populations change over time. It was a really hard idea for people to finally start to grab onto, and sometimes people today even struggle with it. It's pretty straightforward. All it means is that populations aren't static, that they change over time. Now, natural selection and evolution, lots of times people will say that those are the same thing, and they're really not at all. Evolution means that populations or genes essentially are changing over time. Natural selection is simply a mechanism that explains how that occurs. So this is a really simple picture here. Let's say we have a bunch of beetles like this, and the bird comes in and it only sees the lighter colored beetles and it eats those. What happens to the population? The population is going to get darker over time. Last thing I want to talk about is what's called the scientific method. Scientific method is not the only way we do science. So for example, the discovery of DNA and its structure, and more recently the discovery of the human genome, it's discovery science, and so we don't have a hypothesis. We're simply trying to find the answer to a question or to discover something. But if we are using the scientific method, so a great example would be the enzyme lab that we're doing in class right now. In that lab, we're trying to see how changing the concentration of an enzyme, in this case catalase, that's found inside a yeast, affects the rate of reaction. In other words, the breakdown of hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen. And so we've got a question, we're trying to find how that concentration affects the rate of reaction. We then have a hypothesis, and a hypothesis is going to be simply a guess, what we think's happening. We have an independent variable. An independent variable, remember, is the thing that we're going to change in the experiment. In this case, it's going to be the concentration. We've got a dependent variable. That's what we're actually going to measure, the rate of the reaction. We've got a bunch of control variables, everything that we keep the same. And so what makes science cool is that we come up with a question or a problem. We then identify what we think to be the right answer, and then we gather data, and we gather more data, and we gather more data, and then eventually we have theories. And theories carry a huge weight.